Welcome to the Mini Book Podcast, African American Books Edition. Today we are taking a really critical look at the history of racist ideas in America. Our analysis comes straight from the pages of an essential book stamped from the beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America by the historian Ibram X. Kendi. It's just a monumental work, and it charts exactly how discriminatory policies and the ideas created to justify them have, profoundly shaped the American experience. We thank you so much for listening, and please do consider subscribing for future content. After hearing this, we would absolutely encourage you to go out and purchase this book and support the author.
And a quick note for you, the listener. The voices you hear are generated by AI, but the historical content, all the research, it comes directly from the book. We feel that this is a really great and accessible way to learn about African American history. Our goal today is to pull out the most important insights from Kendi's analysis.
Okay, so let's start by unpacking Kendi's central framework. It's really the lens through which he views all of American history. And to understand it, he says we first have to acknowledge the harsh reality of racial disparities in the U.S. today.
That framing is so foundational. These modern disparities, they aren't accidents. They are the measurable outcomes of centuries of policy. When we look at the data from around 2010 to 2012, the numbers are just staggering.
They really are.
For instance, Black households had a median wealth 13 times lower than white households.
13 times.
And Black people were 5 times more likely to be incarcerated than whites.
And the most severe end of that, the use of lethal force, is even more alarming. Young Black males were, 21 times more likely to be killed by police than their white counterparts in just that 2-year span?
Exactly. So the core question Kendi asks is this. How has our society from the 1600s to today tried to explain these deep systemic disparities? And he argues there have always been 3 sides to the argument.
And these 3 positions are the segregationists, the anti-racists, and the assimilationists. Let's start with the clearest one.
The segregationists. They've always argued that these disparities are the fault of Black people themselves.
So an inherent inferiority.
Exactly. A genetic, permanent, natural flaw that explains why Black communities lag behind. It's a view that demands separation.
And then on the complete opposite end, you have the anti-racists.
Right. Anti-racists point entirely to racial discrimination, to systemic power, to bigoted policies. For an anti-racist, there's nothing wrong with Black people. The problem is the system they're forced to operate in.
Okay, and then there's that third group, the assimilationists. This one seems like the most complex because, on the surface, they often sound like they're on the side of progress.
They do, and Kendi argues that's what makes assimilationism so insidious. Assimilationists try to split the difference. They'll acknowledge discrimination, sure, but they also blame Black behaviors.
So they're suggesting a kind of temporary inferiority due to environment or culture.
Precisely. They believe that if Black people could just fix their culture or adopt white norms, the disparities would disappear. They're saying, yes, there's discrimination, but Black culture is also part of the problem.
That's a really tough charge, because it means even well-intentioned ideas can still be rooted in a racist premise.
That's his entire framework in a nutshell. It shows how that middle ground inevitably ends up validating the core idea of inferiority.
So let's apply this. Let's take those police statistics we started with. How would each of these 3 positions explain, say, a high-profile police killing?
Well, a segregationist response is pretty straightforward. They'd blame the victim's criminal behavior. The narrative would paint the person as a threat, justifying the officer's actions. The logic is Black people are inherently disorderly, and police are just responding to that.
Okay, and the anti-racist?
The anti-racists would zoom out and look at the system. They'd point to biased policing, institutional racism, the history of devaluing Black life. They'd look right past the individual action to the context.
And the assimilationist has to find a way to blame both, right?
Right.
The policy and the victim's environment.
Exactly. They might say, well, the police were wrong, but... And then pivot to talking about the cycle of poverty or fatherlessness or gang culture that supposedly leads Black youth into these situations. The focus shifts to fixing the Black community, not just the discrimination.
So the core of the assimilationist view is that these inferior behaviors can be developed or erased.
That's the solution, right? Uplift. This leads to that constant pressure on Black people to adopt white cultural traits as the standard.
You have an example of that, right? From the 40s.
A perfect one. The Swedish economist Gunnar Myrdal. His 1944 study, An American Dilemma, it was the intellectual foundation for a lot of the civil rights movement.
Myrtle's work is seen as very progressive. So what did he say that Kendi flags as assimilationist?
Myrtle explicitly said it was advantageous for American Negroes to become assimilated into American culture, to acquire the traits held in esteem by the dominant white Americans. So while he was advocating for integration, it was based on the racist assumption that part of the Negro problem was the pathology of Black culture itself, that Black traits needed to be shed. The burden was on the victim.
So even the intellectual fuel for the civil rights movement had this racist premise baked in. That's profound. And Kendi also breaks down how racism isn't just one thing. It intersects with other forms of bigotry.
Right. It's not monolithic. It manifests in very specific, intercepting ways.
Let's touch on a few of those. What about gender racism?
Gender racism is where racist ideas about Black women like being hyposexual or overly masculine intersect with sexism. So you get the trope of the strong Black woman.
Which sounds like a compliment on the surface.
It sounds like one, but it's constructed as inferior to the weak white woman who is framed as the ideal. And historically, it's been used to deny Black women protection, resources, or even recognition of their vulnerability. It's a justification. She doesn't need help. She can take it.
And class racism. He says that demeans both the Black poor and the Black elite. How does that work?
Well, it systematically blames the Black poor for their own poverty, which is a classic segregationist argument. But then when a Black person becomes highly successful, they're often dismissed as an extraordinary Negro.
So they're the exception that proves the rule.
Exactly. It allows people to keep the systemic idea of Black inferiority intact for everyone else.
And then there's queer racism and ethnic racism.
Queer racism combines racist and homophobic ideas to place Black queer people at the bottom of some perceived scale of morality or biology. And ethnic racism creates hierarchies among Black ethnic groups, often privileging those who seem more assimilated to white norms. It's a classic divide and conquer tactic.
This framework is it's incredibly powerful for understanding the rest of the book's history. So let's go back. Part 2, the foundations. Kendi starts in a time before race even existed as we know it.
A crucial distinction. In the ancient Greco-Roman world, there were no formal races like Black Africa and White Europe. So racist ideas, justifications for policy didn't exist yet. But prejudice, and especially color prejudice, definitely did.
So what foundations were being laid that would later be, well, weaponized?
Foundations for both hierarchy and, thankfully, for egalitarianism. You had thinkers like Alcidamas saying nature created no one a slave. But at the same time, two key rationalizations for inequality were emerging: the curse theory and the climate theory.
Let's start with the curse theory.
Oh.
This feels like the bedrock for later segregationist thought.
It is. It comes from the biblical story of Noah's son, Ham, whose descendants were supposedly cursed. By the medieval period, some started linking this curse to Africa, suggesting Black people were divinely cursed with dark skin and servitude.
But Kendi says this theory wasn't very powerful at first. Why not?
Because enslavers at the time were enslaving all sorts of people, including many non-Black Europeans. The curse couldn't just apply to one group. It wasn't until the slave trade shifted to focus almost exclusively on people from Africa that the curse theory was, revived and empowered.
The policy changed, so the idea was brought back to justify it.
Policy first, idea second, every time. Now contrast that with the climate theory, which was the early foundation for assimilationist ideas.
And this one suggested that inferiority was temporary, caused by the hot African climate.
Exactly. The focus is on mutability, not permanence. The Islamic scholar Ibn Khaldun helped bolster this idea, suggesting that if you put an African person in a cold environment, they might even adopt European features like white skin. It marked Blackness as this unfortunate but correctable condition.
So by the 1400s, Europe has two competing justifications: permanent inferiority from the curse theory and temporary inferiority from the climate theory.
And this is happening right as the Portuguese are expanding into Africa. This is where the formal recorded history of anti-Black racist ideas really begins, because they needed a justification for this new, massive policy of enslavement.
Prince Henry of Portugal starts framing these ventures as missionary expeditions, not slave raids.
Right. And the chronicler Gomes Eanes de Zurara, in his chronicle in the 1450s, writes the script. His text contains what Kendi calls the inaugural racist ideas that served as the intellectual ammunition for the next 400 years.
And again, the policy came first.
The decision to enslave came first, for economic and political reasons. The racist idea followed to defend it. And while Zurar's actual book spread slowly, the justification for African slavery spread like wildfire through trade networks.
And then these ideas get translated to early colonial America through things like travel literature.
Yeah, these sensationalized, often totally fabricated accounts of Africa. Leo Africanus's descriptions were a big one, portraying Africans as hypersexual, lacking reason, living a beastly kind of life, and this just reignited that old debate. Is this beastliness permanent, or can it be fixed?
Which brings us to the critical moment in Virginia, where English common law was a huge problem for enslavers.
A huge problem. First, English common law generally said you couldn't enslave Christians, but more importantly, a child's status came from the father. So if a white man impregnated an enslaved woman, that child was potentially free.
A direct threat to the labor supply.
A massive threat. This all came to a head with the Elizabeth Key case, so the lawmakers in Virginia had to do something drastic.
They had to, as Kendi puts it, trash English law.
They did. In 1662, they adopted a Roman legal principle, partus sequitur ventrum.
Okay, that's a mouthful. What does that actually mean in practice?
It's Latin for that which is brought forth follows the belly. It meant a child's status came exclusively from the mother. So any child born to an enslaved woman was automatically enslaved for life, no matter who the father was.
That one legal change secured the future of hereditary racialized slavery.
It did, and it immediately created the need for another racist idea, one to justify the rampant sexual violence against black women that this new law enabled. Rape became literally an economic means of production.
And that justification showed up in the literature.
Absolutely. Henry Neville's 1668 story, The Isle of Pines, is a horrifying example. It creates the racist trope of the black woman as uniquely sexually aggressive. This became the necessary idea to mask the reality of rape by white men, shifting all the blame for sexual desire onto African women.
It's a chilling cycle, a discriminatory law, and then a cultural narrative to blame the victim. Let's move into part 3, because these ideas start to get embedded in, of all things, the Enlightenment.
Right, the great paradox. Science and theology start to team up. You have scientists like Robert Boyle and Isaac Newton popularizing the idea that light is white is standard. Newton's work in optics positioned whiteness as the pure, rational center.
And culturally, this whiteness gets attached to God, to Adam, to everything good.
Michelangelo had already painted Adam and God as white, so Christianity, freedom, reason, it's all being framed as the domain of white people, right as the transatlantic slave trade is hitting its peak.
Which brings us to Cotton Mather, the Puritan minister. Kendi calls him America's first great assimilationist. How did he square the circle of Christianity and slavery?
Mather was a pragmatist. He rejected the segregationist idea that Africans were beasts. He insisted they are men and not beasts. They have souls. But to justify slavery, he argued their souls were as white and good as those of other nations, if only they would convert.
So Christian slavery. The body can be in bondage as long as the soul is saved.
That's the formula. Baptism doesn't change your physical condition. Masters had a duty to save the resisting souls, but they still had total control over the resisting bodies. African people could become white in their souls. A terrifyingly neat solution.
Now, contrast him with someone like Samuel Sewall, who wrote one of the first anti-slavery pamphlets.
Right, The Selling of Joseph in 1700. Sewall rejected all the pro-slavery arguments, but he was still deeply racist. He argued that New England should get rid of slavery and get rid of African people.
Wait, so he was an abolitionist because he was anti-black?
That's Kendi's point. An early example of anti-racism based on anti-black racism. Sewall believed black people could never live with us and grow up into orderly families. He wanted them gone because he saw their presence as a corrupting influence.
Wow. And the Enlightenment just kept formalizing these ideas with science.
This is when it really hardens into pseudoscience. You get Carl Linnaeus and his taxonomy in Systema Naturae in 1735. He creates this rigid racial hierarchy.
And he puts Europeans at the top, of course.
Of course. H. sapiens europaeus is very smart, inventive, ruled by law. And at the bottom, H. sapiens Africans are sluggish, lazy, ruled by caprice. He even threw in notes about their biology to make it sound scientific.
This also led to a huge debate over human origins.
Mm-hmm.
Monogenesis versus polygenesis. Can you break those down?
Sure. Monogenesis was the traditional Christian idea. We all come from Adam and Eve, so we're all one species. Polygenesis, which was championed by thinkers like Voltaire, was the idea that races were created separately, that were different species.
And polygenesis was a gift to enslavers.
The ultimate gift. Voltaire literally argued then, Negro race is a species of men as different from ours as the breed of spaniels is from that of greyhound. If they're a separate, inferior species, there's no moral problem with enslaving them forever.
Which leads us to the great contradiction himself, Thomas Jefferson.
Right. The man who wrote, "All men are created equal," while owning hundreds of people. Early on, he blamed England for slavery, which was a neat trick to defend liberty while protecting his own assets. But his real racist ideas come out in Notes on the State of Virginia.
In that book, he proposes emancipation, but then colonization, sending them all back to Africa. Why was removal so critical for him?
Because he believed free black people could never be incorporated into America. He cloaked his prejudice in this faux scientific neutrality, saying he could never find that a black had uttered a thought above the level of plain narration.
He even questioned Phyllis Wheatley's poetry.
He did. He said religion produced her, but it could not produce a poet. And he ultimately stated that black people are inferior to the whites in the endowments both of body and mind.
So his solution was this blend of assimilationist and segregationist thought.
It was a political masterstroke. Free them, but get them out. It satisfied everyone who held racist beliefs for different reasons.
And these ideas get written directly into the Constitution with the 3/5 compromise.
The compromise was all about political power for the South, but the idea behind it, that a black person was somehow both human and subhuman, was a perfect fit for both dominant racist ideologies.
How did it fit both?
Well, for segregationists, being 35ths of a person confirmed their permanent inherent inferiority. For assimilationists, it suggested they were just sub-white, maybe capable of becoming a whole person someday if they were developed. It was a mathematical formula for racial hierarchy.
Okay, let's jump into the 19th century. Abolitionists are fighting slavery, but they're using the same flawed logic. Tell us about the strategy of uplift suasion.
Uplift suasion was basically the idea that free black people had to act perfectly. They had to demonstrate perfect literacy, sobriety, industry. The goal was to prove to white people that the stereotypes were wrong and undermine the justification for slavery.
Which seems like a noble, if maybe naive strategy. Why does Kendi say it's inherently racist?
Because the entire premise is that negative black behavior is partly responsible for racism. It accepts that there might be some truth to the stereotypes, and it puts the entire burden of solving racism on the people being victimized.
An impossible standard to meet.
Completely impossible, because they were human and humanly flawed. And even when free blacks did succeed, they were just dismissed as extraordinary Negroes, exceptions. The rule of inferiority remained.
Meanwhile, Jefferson's idea of colonization is gaining steam, especially after slave rebellions.
Fear was the driver. That led directly to the American Colonization Society, or ACS, which became this huge organization in the 1820s. They founded Liberia.
And it united both segregationists and assimilationists.
It did. Segregationists saw it as a way to get rid of a perceived threat. And well-meaning assimilationists saw it as a chance for black people to develop their own society away from white influence. But of course, most free black people rejected it as a forced exile.
And at the same time, scientific racism is making a comeback, this time using anatomy.
Yes, a big focus on biological determinism. You have doctors measuring skulls and muscles to prove that the European anatomical structure was superior.
This finds its most horrific expression in the story of Sarah Baartman.
Her story is just chilling. She was exhibited across Europe because of her large buttocks and genitals, and these features were presented as being typical for all African people, confirming this racist stereotype of black people being more animal than human.
And it continued even after she died.
The famous French scientist Georges Cuvier dissected her body and concluded she was closer to an ape than a human. Her skeleton, her brain, her preserved genitals were then put on public display in Paris until 1974. It was treated as powerful physical evidence for segregationist ideas.
It's just incredible how deep these ideas ran, even among famous abolitionists. Let's talk about William Lloyd Garrison and Harriet Beecher Stowe.
Garrison popularized the assimilationist idea that slavery had imbruted black people, that the oppression itself had made their cultures inferior. So while he was fighting the policy, he was reinforcing the idea that black people had been damaged into a lesser state.
So he was fighting the cause, but accepting the effect as a sign of inferiority.
Exactly. And then you have Harriet Beecher Stowe and Uncle Tom's Cabin. Kendi calls it perhaps the most effective tool of racist abolitionism ever.
How can the most famous anti-slavery novel be racist abolitionism?
Because Stowe's genius was to accept the enslaver's premise of black inferiority, that black people were naturally docile, childlike, intellectually inferior, and then flip it. She argued that those exact traits made them the best Christians.
So she used the stereotype to argue against slavery.
She did. The book created enormous sympathy and was a powerful tool, but it was all based on this deep-seated belief in Black character as being meek and subservient.
A crucial distinction. The book fought the policy, but cemented the idea of intellectual inferiority.
And that's Kendi's point throughout. If you don't dismantle the ideas, they just evolve and get used for the next discriminatory policy.
Okay, let's move into Reconstruction. Emancipated Black Americans are demanding real freedom, and they have a very different idea of what that means.
They understood that freedom required economic independence. They told Union officials, we must have land. They completely rejected uplift persuasion. They basically said, racist ideas are the problem of the people who hold them, not our problem.
But white policy rejected those demands for land.
Categorically. Confiscated Confederate land was often given to Northern whites or returned to the former enslavers. And this policy was immediately justified with a racist idea. White settlers getting land was American freedom, but Black people getting land would be a handout.
This keeps Black people economically weak. And the legal framework for Reconstruction, the 14th Amendment, becomes the next battleground.
Right. The amendment was meant to fight the Black codes, but it had this critical, deliberate ambiguity. Kendi argues its biggest weakness was that the courts focused on discriminatory language, like a Jim Crow sign, not discriminatory outcomes.
And why was that focus on intent so disastrous?
It created a giant loophole. Discriminators could just stop using racial language. They could create poll taxes or literacy tests that were race-neutral on paper but had devastatingly discriminatory results. They got away with what Kendi calls racial murder.
By the 1870s, the national will for Reconstruction is gone.
It's abandoned. And this shift is fueled by sensationalist books like Pike's The Prostrate State, which passed as journalism. It blamed all of the South's corruption on Black politicians, completely ignoring the major role of white politicians. It reinforced the idea that Black people were unfit to govern.
This all leads to the legal nail in the coffin, Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896.
Justice Henry Billings Brown explicitly used segregationist ideas to uphold the policy. He called Louisiana's Separate Car Act a social law that just recognized the social distinction between races.
And the premise that justified his conclusion.
He literally wrote, if one race be inferior to the other socially, the Constitution of the United States cannot put them upon the same plane. That's the segregationist idea becoming the law of the land.
It's just a direct line. And this era also saw the formalization of that queer racism we talked about earlier.
Yes, you had medical scholars trying to find biological proof of inferiority, claiming Black lesbians had physical abnormalities that placed them at the bottom of the scale of womanhood, a tool of ultimate dehumanization.
Okay, let's move into the 20th century, part 6, and see how these ideas modernized.
The century starts with this really strange figure, William Hannibal Thomas, a Black author who wrote The American Negro in 1901. It was filled with horrifying stereotypes, claiming 90% of Black women were lascivious by instinct.
And his Blackness made him the perfect dispenser of racist ideas.
That's the tragic irony. His skin color made him an authoritative expert for the white Americans who loved the book. They could accept his racist ideas without feeling defensive. He became known as the Black Judas.
And these ideas were now being spread by powerful new media. Cultural racism.
We have to talk about The Birth of a Nation from 1915, Hollywood's first big feature film. It was just a massively powerful piece of segregationist propaganda.
It portrayed Reconstruction as a nightmare of Black supremacy.
And it revitalized the Ku Klux Klan. President Woodrow Wilson reportedly saw it in the White House and called it writing history with lightning. The film played a direct policy role in justifying segregation and sparking violence.
And alongside film, there was pulp fiction, like Tarzan of the Apes.
Tarzan just cemented that association of Africa with animals and savages. The hero, Tarzan, which means white skin, is the one who teaches the African ape-like children. It's the ultimate white savior narrative.
Let's talk about W.E.B. Du Bois. Kendi tracks his evolution away from the traditional strategy of educational persuasion.
Du Bois, as editor of The Crisis, started out believing that if he just gave white Americans the facts and data, he could educate them out of racism. But by the 1930s, he saw it was a failure. He wrote that Americans know the facts, and yet they remain, for the most part, indifferent.
And this led him to advocate for voluntary Black separation.
Yes. He started arguing that Black people should focus on building up their own institutions, schools, businesses, instead of constantly trying to break into white ones that didn't want them.
This leads to his great work, Black Reconstruction in America, where he introduces the concept of the wages of whiteness. Can you explain that?
The wages of whiteness are the psychological and public privileges that poor white laborers got just for being white. It wasn't about money, it was about social status, a sense of superiority that compensated them for their own economic exploitation, and, crucially, prevented them from uniting politically with black laborers.
So racism was a tool elites used to divide the working class.
A brilliant and devastating tool.
Even as the civil rights movement gets going, these assimilationist ideas persist.
We go back to Gunnar Myrdal, defining the problem as a moral dry rot for white people. This leads to that classic assimilationist phrase, "We have come a long way and we have a ways to go," which Kendi says avoids the brutal reality of the present.
And culturally, the white savior narrative comes back with To Kill a Mockingbird in 1960.
Right. It became the Uncle Tom's Cabin of its time. It created sympathy, but Kendi calls it a racist relic because it promotes the idea that black people need a white savior, Atticus Finch, to fight for them. They aren't the agents of their own liberation.
Okay, this brings us to the most critical turning point in Kendi's entire argument, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. A huge victory, but one that he says gave birth to the most racist idea to date.
The act focused on abolishing clear, intentional discrimination, the Jim Crow signs. The loophole was that it did not bar policies that were race-neutral on the surface, but produced discriminatory outcomes.
So if legal discrimination is gone, but the disparities are still there, what's the new idea to explain that gap?
The new idea is the presumption that discrimination had been eliminated. So if racial disparities continue after 1964, it can't be the fault of the system anymore. It must be the fault of black people, their culture, their behavior, their inferiority. It resurrected the segregationist argument in a new colorblind package.
And this was quickly written into law, giving employers cover.
Oh, yes. Title VII allowed employers to use professionally developed ability tests. And because of the historical gaps in test scores, which came from unequal schooling, companies could justify huge racial disparities in hiring while claiming to be race neutral.
So to many Americans, the achievement gap became proof that something was wrong with the test takers, not the system.
And that laid the groundwork for the rise of law and order politics.
Richard Nixon.
Nixon perfected it. He could speak to racists without ever saying a racist word. He just talked about law and order and crime, and his supporters could avoid admitting to himself that he was attracted by the racist appeal.
And the Reagan era's war on drugs was the ultimate policy expression of this.
It was. Drug crime was actually declining, but Reagan manufactured this war that disproportionately targeted non-white communities, and the result was ingeniously cruel. It sent millions of nonviolent people to prison where they couldn't vote.
The way to quietly suppress the political power of your opponents.
An ingeniously cruel way, as Kendi puts it, and this all reinforced the ultimate modern racist mandate, personal responsibility.
Which became the dominant idea in the 90s with the Contract with America.
It completed the cycle. It ignored all the history of discrimination and wealth destruction and placed the blame for all remaining disparities squarely on the shoulders of black individuals for their supposed moral and behavioral failures.
This incredible history leads Kendi to his conclusion about why traditional anti-racist strategies have, for the most part, failed.
He identifies three key failures. First, the failure of self-sacrifice, asking white Americans to sacrifice their privilege. This is based on the myth that racism actually benefits most white people.
But Kendi argues the opposite is true.
Right. The vast majority of white people have been economically exploited by the same elites who benefit from racism. A truly equal society would benefit them too. So self-sacrifice is a flawed argument.
Second, the failure of uplift suasion.
We saw this. It just leads to the extraordinary Negro problem. The success of a few doesn't change the system. It's used to justify it. The rule of black inferiority remains intact.
And finally, the failure of educational persuasion.
This fails because racist ideas aren't born from ignorance. You can't educate someone out of a belief they hold because it serves their political or economic self-interest. The ideas are produced to justify discrimination, not the other way around.
So if all those strategies have failed, what does Kendi's history show is the only thing that works? The anti-racist path.
The only thing history shows is that the elimination of racial discrimination must come first. Policy change precedes belief change, and that only happens when powerful people see it's in their own self-interest, or when anti-racist protesters create conditions so disruptive that policymakers are forced to act.
This history, from the curse of Ham to the rhetoric of personal responsibility, It reveals this persistent dynamic. Discrimination creates racist ideas to justify itself. It's just a stark reminder that belief follows policy, not the other way around. We should always be asking ourselves, what discriminatory policy is this new idea trying to justify?
We really hope this exploration encourages you to reflect on these historical patterns and maybe to recognize these three positions, segregationist, assimilationist, and anti-racist, in the debates you hear today.
If you enjoyed this mini-book podcast, please subscribe and share it with others. We would love to know which African-American history books you would like us to cover next, so please feel free to suggest them in the comments. Thank you for subscribing and listening.